So by declaring the social class of its staff, could the BBC promote diversity or perhaps punish people for the schools that their parents sent them to? I'm joined by the journalist Benedict Spence and Ash Sarkar, who's senior editor at Novara Media, where she focuses on race and class. Very good to see you both. Now you can disclose if you like. I'm not going to push you either way. What do you think about this idea, Ash, that, presumably not just the BBC, but that media organisations should let people know where their staff are coming from, their backgrounds?
I mean, I think this is a really exciting proposal because criticisms of the homogeneity of the media have been levelled for a really long time now. So around the time of the Grenfell tragedy, Jon Snow said, none of us saw this coming, and we've got to look at the composition of our newsrooms and ask ourselves, have we just been talking to the wrong people all this time? And, a disaster like this happens and it takes everyone by surprise when it shouldn't. So I think that this is the first time we've seen a really senior politician in this country try and address that head on. I'm really glad that social class is going to be measured, or at least it could be if Corbyn comes into number 10, alongside race and gender. The problem with race and gender is that it's often been separated off from class, so you end up with the most privileged people amongst marginalised groups getting those top jobs, and nothing really changes in terms of the outlook of big organisations. I think with measuring things like social class, we'll be breaking out of that Westminster bubble, breaking out of some of that chumminess, some of that myopia. We can tell the stories that really matter to people in this country.
Benedict, broad thoughts.
I think if Mr Corbyn paid more attention to the media and engaged with the media a bit more rather than just ignoring them and refusing to answer their questions, he'd know that the BBC already publishes this information. In March this year, in fact, they published the information regards the type of schools that all of their employees went to, as well as the ethnic, sexual and gendered information of all their staff. So, for example, of all the employees at the BBC, 83.5% went to state schools. Now, that might not sound like as much as it should be, but actually, if you take a look at the number of people that went to private schools from 16 to 18, that's to say the majority of people who go into higher education afterwards across the UK, it is 18%. So actually, state school pupils are pretty much equally represented across the BBC. If you want to go further, you can. And in fact, elsewhere, the BBC is much better, much better at being diverse. So, for example, 2% of the population of the UK identify as LGBT. 10% of BBC employees identified that way. If you want to look at, for example, working age disability, 5% of the UK are disabled. 10% of BBC staff are disabled. If you want to look at ethnic minority people,
I mean, it's very
13% are ethnic minorities in this country. 14.5% are BBC employees. 14.5% of BBC employees are ethnic minorities. The only one where it falls down on is women, where it is 48%. As opposed to more or less 50%. Okay. If we want to talk about diversity, actually it's doing a pretty good job.
Looking, if they got more women, would we be looking at the social class of the women and the social class
already out there. Okay. That's the important thing.
So you're saying it's much more complex, and the BBC is actually doing quite well in so many other areas.
I mean, the study that you're talking about doesn't measure commission programming, so it would be collecting more data than has been collected before. And there are lots more ways to measure social class than simply what school you went to. So you might not have gone to a fee-paying school, but you might have gone to some of those top state schools that we have in the country, which are still incredibly competitive and still quite homogenous.
Just let me throw in there, Ash. I mean, would there be then compulsion to get rid of some of these people then? Would they be punished for having been sent there, as I said in my introduction, by and large, by your parents?
I don't think that that's what's going to happen, because any of these changes in terms of quotas tend to be incremental so that you're not pushing people out. And what I think is really exciting about Corbyn's proposals, and I think you have to look at all of them as a whole, is that by introducing this digital licence fee, is that there's room to set up, I think, new access schemes to bring in talent from the kind of entry-level jobs right up to the most senior positions in the BBC, democratising the boards and things like that, so you can have more diversity. And it's not about pushing people out, it's about bringing new people in.
People are going to say, Benedict, isn't it just about talent? Isn't it just about people who make good programmes? And the BBC doesn't seem to be doing too badly at it at the moment. With the
you'd hope that it would be about talent, that the best people would develop Top Gear. Well, you'd hope that the best people for the job would be the ones getting the job. And what I would say is that the system sort of proves that it is working. The fact that actually so many minorities are doing better than they exist, as it were, per head in the country, many more are getting jobs at the BBC. That's a good thing. But I just wonder, actually, what is this about? This already exists, this information. The BBC is a really interesting target to pick on. Why not pick on any number of privately owned media organisations for which we don't have this information? And that's perhaps something that he should address before he comes to the BBC. What I didn't like about his speech earlier today was the way that he used the BBC in conjunction with the phrase fake news. It seemed rather authoritarian, it seemed a little populist, as we know that is often he is sometimes wont to do. And the fact that he's then pinpointing journalists' backgrounds and saying these people should reveal these things because otherwise we don't know what their inherent bias is. That starts to dig into the integrity of these people. It starts to undermine.
Did that make you worry a bit, Ash? I mean, you know, a government getting involved in recommending the kind of people, the type of people you should employ, and as Benedict's saying there, talk, for instance, of a fund there to fund independent journalism. Now, what happens if they want to do a deep investigation into the background and finances of the Labour Party? If
well, then
power,
they would.
But who controls the fund?
Then they would be free to. The point is that these things will be democratically overseen by people within the BBC, and they will be publicly appointed. So it's got very little to do with the Labour Party. And as it stands now, because of the charter renewal system every 10 years, is that the overall strategic direction of the BBC is uncomfortably beholden to whoever happens to be in power at the time. If it's established on a permanent footing,
well, I would say it's not. I mean,
that's
that's why it hasn't got its own charter. It's entirely independent of government.
But every 10 years, there's a huge amount of ministerial oversight and meddling with the process of the BBC. If it's established on a permanent footing, that will reduce the amount that the state can meddle with it.
And what is this if not political meddling? Trying to get journalists to reveal their backgrounds, which actually has nothing to do with their political views whatsoever.
So then let's have a look at someone like Rona Fairhead, who was chair of the BBC Trust until that got scrapped and there was a new body brought into its place. She was chair of HSBC's auditing team while the cartel money laundering scandal was going on. There was a huge amount of concern about her role in the BBC, and then look, her chumminess with the government means she gets quite a cushy job in the Department for International Trade after she leaves the BBC. There's this revolving door at the moment between people working for the BBC in quite cushy government jobs, and understandably that's got a lot of the public glory.
You have people standing for election.
Seamus Milne had a very cushy role at The Guardian. He's now doing
let's not just bandy names around. Just that point about governments, any government, interference in independent broadcasting, whether it's the BBC or not. If it's got control of funds, it's raising money through taxation to distribute to whomever it wants. That surely is the antithesis of independent journalism.
Well, I do actually think there is an element of truth to that. It does concern me, elements of the BBC's output, but actually journalism is not some sort of public service. Journalism is a product that you have to sell. There's been an awful lot of concern, for example, over the dropping audiences, for example, on the Today programme at the BBC. People wouldn't be concerned if it was just a public service, because it wouldn't matter, it would always be there. The point is, actually, if you're trying to get people to engage with these things, you have to provide something for them. The BBC, by trying to be unbiased, by trying to be balanced, is coming under a lot of flack from just about everybody, because everybody who has a perspective will always disagree with all views that disagree with their own worldview. And the BBC, by trying to be unbalanced, is therefore going to annoy everyone.
As they say, probably doing something right. Listen, we're out of time. Ash Sarkar, very good to see you. Benedict Spence, thank you very much indeed. Spence, not Spencer. Got that right now.